So we'll just chat happily for a little while, and then during which, hopefully, many questions will occur to you, and you will write them down in Sharpie, or your next-door neighbor will, and ask them when we get some time. I'd like to kick things off just by talking about desserts. Obviously, that's why we're here. This is the first of hopefully many more books. This is the first dessert cookbook. So what took you so long?
I'm not really sure. I mean, I have been involved in all sorts of projects, but Helen and I have been baking and talking about cakes for 11 years now, working our way through tons of recipes over the years. I mean, in Ottolenghi, in our shops in London, we sell cakes and pastries and sweets and all sorts of delicious things, but we've just never come around to do a cookbook. And then a couple of years ago, we said, okay, it's finally time for us to do the baking book that we've always wanted to make, and we did.
You finally had a gap between a couple of books.
I had a slot for yeah. No, the time had come. I mean, it is true that we have been developing those recipes for well over a decade, and we said, okay, it's time to publish a baking book.
I should confess to having cheated on this whole thing a bit, because they were in the LA Times test kitchen earlier today, baking. In fact, we had the pleasure of watching them and eating afterwards a rolled pavlova. And so anyway, it'll be in the paper in a bit. But one of the things that we were talking about was a bit about the difference between pastry and savory cooking, and the difference in terms of cookbooks as well. And you said something I thought was really interesting, which is savory tends to focus on ingredients, whereas baking and pastry tend to focus on technique. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that a bit.
Yes, I mean, it's a generalization, I guess, because both elements exist in both ways of cooking. But the way when I look at this book, it's kind of clear that, most recipes would have 5 core ingredients, which would be butter, sugar, eggs, flour, 4. Did I miss something?
Chocolate.
Butter, sugar, egg, flour. No, chocolate, no.
Alcohol.
And then there's stuff around this, but essentially you can create incredibly different things with those 4 ingredients. And we're talking about cookies and desserts and things that are kind of start off their life as these kind of 4 ingredients, and then end up something completely different. And it does boil down to technique. Of course, you can add chocolate, or you can add dried fruit or fresh fruit, or you can add a dash of this or a dash of that. But essentially, it's those 4 ingredients that are kind of present throughout the book, and it is all about what you do with them, how you treat them, whether you're going to boil the sugar, or whether you're going to add it to the butter into creaming, or whether you're going to sabayon it, mixing it with eggs first. So there's a lot of different ways of treating those ingredients, and you get very, very different things. With savory cooking, you look at the recipe, but it's all about the ingredients. I mean, if it's going to be chard or kale or trout or chicken, you're going to get very different things, but it's all about that particular ingredient. So yeah, I think that generalization is true.
Yeah.
Was there anything that you bumped into over the course of all the time it took you to write this book that you weren't expecting? I mean, you've done recipe testing for a long time. You've worked in restaurants. You've had this wonderful small empire that we're all so grateful for. Anything that was unexpected?
I'm trying to think what was unexpected. I mean, like you say, that testing recipes is kind of what we do for a living at the moment, or I've done for a long time.
I mean, there wasn't anything sort of surprising in the sense that when we came to working on the book, we'd already been sort of talking and eating cake for 8 years. What was surprising? I think what was surprising was really how smoothly it all went, actually.
More reasons to buy the book, I guess, right? Yeah.
No, the one thing that is I think what is interesting about this particular book, that it started off by wanting to be the ultimate collection of Ottolenghi recipes that we've published over the years, served over the years, not published, and it ended up being something that plus much more. And I think this is the dynamic of writing a cookbook is a very particular one, because you start off by thinking you have a certain idea of where you're gonna end, but during the process, quite a lot of things came up. So we felt, okay, it's gonna be those, biscuits, cookies, cakes, etc., that we make. But then we decided, okay, we want a dessert section, and we don't really do kind of so many plated desserts.
No.
And then we wanted to do confectionery, and then we were missing a cake. And then one day I was calling Helen and said, we're really missing color in this book because everything is brown. So, as cakes tend to be. And so Helen was like, okay, now let me think. And she came up with a bunch of more colorful things. One of them is the vertical striped cake, which has got black currants and lemon in it, and it's a beautiful cake. It's not very Ottolenghi in the sense that it's got buttercream, and we don't use a lot of buttercream in our baking, but it ended up, adding quite a lot of color to the book. So it's an interesting process.
It really
isn't
evolved quite organically. I think we were very open to not having an agenda, except obviously it started with some of the things that we love at Ottolenghi, which we really wanted to have in the book. And then it was a process of just sort of watching it develop and unfurl. And I think one of the things that we were very conscious about was this idea that we wanted it to be accessible.
Yeah.
So, we wanted people to use it. And then the feedback was, what if you had children? What if you had family? And you wanted to sort of have a range of things that you could make with children. So we had a big cookie section. And then what about gift giving? Because part of our ethos is about the joy of giving, celebrating events and giving. So then we had that section.
Yeah, and also I think that's actually also an interesting point that I've only just understood recently about the difference again between savory cooking and baking. Helen mentioned the act of giving, and I think the act of giving is almost embedded in the act of baking. Mm-hmm. So when you cook normally in a functional way. Of course, you can create a feast for a group and create a host, etc. But with baking, it's by definition that you bake to give, to share.
It's much nicer to receive, beautifully wrapped meringues than like a whole baked fish.
Yeah.
Generally speaking.
I know.
And also, I guess you wouldn't bake a cake and eat it all yourself,
Sometimes,
generally.
right.
Not always.
Yeah, and maybe we could talk about meringues since, one does. I went to your shop in Notting Hill, and you're hit by meringues. It's just this beautiful sort of trellis of meringues, if you will, and that's kind of a recurrent theme in your book, it seems, or maybe I just pick it up like yellow VWs or something, but it's very, very accessible.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting because it's egg whites, and you guys were saying a bit earlier in the kitchen, it's something that we take for granted, often throw away, but if you're a pastry chef, you find egg whites.
Yeah, when I worked in a very large commercial kitchens, we churned through a lot of ice cream and custards and brulees, and what's left over is egg whites.
Yeah.
And often it's where you make that extra bit of money actually from in a very big kitchen, a restaurant like that. And I always say, egg whites are free, but actually more than that, they're really versatile. They keep really well, they freeze really well. And I don't think it's sort of the meringue so much as the fact that it's easy to work with. Yeah. And the idea, the pavlova that we made today, it's a blank canvas to so much when you think of what you can flavor your cream and put in any kind of seasonal fruits on it. And it changes according to your whim.
Yeah, and I think people don't understand it. You can get quite technical and geeky about it, but egg whites are the vehicle, a key vehicle for baking. You incorporate air, it holds it, it creates a structure. It's the basis for so many cakes and for so many confectionery items. And I think meringues are the ultimate example because it's really just egg whites and sugar plus another flavor if you want to add to it. But egg whites and sugar are structurally very sound. You can build on them. You can make it solid, or you can make it soft, as we did with our roll pavlova by adding one or two things. It's a kind of a building block, a very basic building block of the pastry kitchen.
And it's accessible. You know, you can teach a kid how to do that easier than whipping cream, because you don't have to worry about over whipping it in quite the same way.
Yeah.
You can dump it. You can make sort of big pillowy things. You can make marshmallows. You can
Yeah,
make
we've got a
whatever.
few meringue recipes in there, or pavlova recipes, and they differ by, yes, essentially it's egg whites and sugar, but we vary the oven temperature, we vary the kind of sugar. One has a brown sugar in it, so it's a little chewy and more caramelized flavor, and the other one uses, sort of white sugar, so it's crunchier and sort of more textural.
Yeah, and also with the meringue, you can really lift things. So if we were talking about having a lemon pie, the moment you pipe meringues on top and put it under the grill, it's a completely different kind of thing, or passion fruit, or whatever you choose to do with it. But the meringues just give it a much more kind of regal look. But they're also very practical for us. That's why they're in the window, because they keep
They're stable.
and they're sturdy.
Yeah.
I know it sounds very kind of
Practical.
prosaic and practical, but it is true. They are very useful.
Do we have, somebody threatened that we had pictures, because it seems tragic to talk about baking and not look at it. Oh, yeah. So what is this lovely thing? Can you see? Here's the cheat sheet, I think.
These are Victoria sponges, and essentially the photographers who made this beautiful book are an American couple called Taylor and Jen, and Victoria sponge is a very British thing, so we couldn't just present it as in a very British way, as Mary Berry would, which some people know who she is. So we had to. So Taylor said, let's just pile them up, which you would never do. It's like breaking all the structure and putting it, and it ended up looking quite good like that. So we went for that.
We'd like to. We'd like to straddle that line between something familiar and then with a little surprise. And apart from the sort of pile up, which the average British probably wouldn't do, the cream in it is a white chocolate cream. So we put a little twist in it because, I think we see recipes as sort of a conversation. That you have one. Someone's done it one way, and then it's kind of in the repository or in the world of recipes, and we extract it and we put a little twist to it. We put it back in. Someone else might, add something to it. So it's a kind of ongoing conversation, and this was our little bit to it.
And there's lots of sponges in this book, obviously, because it's a baking book. And we're kind of, when we have our, geeky conversations about cakes and sponges, we do get quite technical about it, and how to do it, where to do it, if you're going to grease the ring or not grease the ring, and what effects it's going to have over the thing. And we one of the other sponges that we have in the book are the powder puffs that we were talking about earlier, and those are. That most people don't really know them. They're an Australian thing. Helen?
Yeah, it's essentially the Italian savory biscuits, they're dry, and usually that's used in tiramisu, where it softens and yields to this gorgeous dessert. And the powder puffs start off being sort of dry, ordinary biscuits. I first had it. I'm really proud of this recipe because it's taken me 30 years to have it, to get it done on paper. And I had it decades ago. I hate to reveal my age, but it was decades ago at a funeral. And it was somebody I wasn't very close with. I was going there as a supportive.
Okay. That's better.
No, I don't mean the deceased, but I was going there as a partner to be supportive for somebody who knew the deceased. This is all sounding very weird. It gets weirder. And so what came to the table at the wake were these, actually it was piled up a little bit like that. And I ate it, and I literally swooned. It was just the most gloriously ethereal thing I'd ever eaten, just completely, I didn't know at the time that it was called powder puffs, but if you can imagine what a powder puff might taste like, sort of pillowy and soft and delicious. And anyway, I broke up with this person. I never got the recipe, alas. And years went by, and one day I saw I was living in Australia at the time, and this funeral was in the country Victoria. And one day in the national paper, a very well-known chef called Stephanie Alexander, who had a regular column there, she published a recipe, and the title was Aunt Peggy's powder puffs. And something about Aunt Peggy, which is a sort of old-fashioned kind of name, I hope I'm not offending anybody here, something about Aunt Peggy and powder puffs, I instantly knew that this was the thing I'd eaten all those years ago. And I duly attempted the recipe, and she gave very strict instructions to sieve the flour 3 times and not over-folding it, and I made it, and it was exactly this thing that I had eaten at this funeral. And here was our chance to have it in the book, and now you have the recipe. So,
and we added all sorts of. We kind of did the Ottolenghi it, and we added a bit of rose water and raspberries.
And rose water. And then we decided, actually, well, if that was a bit summery and light, that we could have a sort of more autumnal, wintry version, and that's a chocolate and chestnut version of that as well. Yeah.
Okay. We know what we're doing when we're going home.
Excuse my excitement talking about that, but it's been a long time coming. Yeah.
So just back to what you just said a minute ago, Yotam, you said you Ottolenghified it, which is interesting because for many of us who read your cookbooks all the time, it seems like you've done that to a lot of food, i.e. most of Middle Eastern food in the last 5 or 6 years. Thank you. But how does that apply to desserts?
So I think, with the desserts, Helen and I, so Helen has a Southeast Asian background because she grew up in Malaysia, and I've got my Middle Eastern background growing up in Israel. But actually the cakes we bake are not from those cultures. Actually, those are more from the European, Australian, North American traditions. And so when our flavors of our childhoods come through, they come through with the seasonings, with a few ingredients. So use certain spices, with the use of certain fruit and nuts like pistachios and figs, with the halva and tahini. So with certain ingredients, we kind of snuck into recipes that are not naturally using those ingredients, but not because we wanted to make it. It wasn't a conscious decision to make them different, just because we wanted to makes things a little bit more exciting.
Well, also, those are the flavors and things that we love, and I think ultimately every recipe in there, Yotam and I had to love it before it made it through to the next stage, which is sort of someone else testing it in their kitchen.
Yeah, and it's a fine line where we walk all the time between keeping things traditionally and breaking the rules a little bit. And Helen was talking about the Victoria sponge. The Victoria sponge is something that's been around for a long time. A lot of people in the UK especially know how to make it and what they're talking about. So you're not just going to waste a recipe for delivering something which is completely the same, and you have to respect, how much it is about the texture of the sponge and really nothing else. But you really want to put your mark on it. So this is where we come in and we have these conversations. Are we authentic? Are we not? What can you do in order to make it a little bit more exciting, but not break the rules completely? So with every recipe, we've had to have these discussions. And some recipes we haven't really played around with a lot. There is a lemon and poppy seed drizzle cake, which we call the National Trust cake, because in Britain there are National Trust properties, which are old buildings you go to, and then there's always a restaurant that serves very plain cakes. And we call it the National Trust cake because it is like the sort of cake you'd get with in one of those buildings. But it's really, really good. We love it. It's simple. It's delicious. It's got a great crumb. Right. And we just thought, Helen always says it's one of her favorite cakes because you would have it any time, really.
Yes, any time. Yeah, every day if possible.
Well, that's actually a really interesting segue because it gets us back to the Great British Baking Show, which one has to. And to technique, back to technique and back to what, as you pointed out, is a fairly traditional book in an odd way. But that's a very, I think, really lovely line that you guys hit between bringing it up to date, modernizing it, whatever that means, and having respect for what in some ways are very, very classical recipes.
I think the bedrock of it is the sort of European tradition where there's been sort of decades of honed in techniques and we, there's, why waste that? They're there for, they're understandably sort of classics. But then I guess to modernize it in a way is part of adding to that conversation. How do we want to sort of do it without being gratuitous?
Well,
I
right.
think,
And that's something
know-
that, and that's what I mean by the very fine line, the beautiful line that you guys managed to do, because a lot of people have problems with that.
Yeah.
They make it gratuitous or
The trick is to know what works for that particular cake and what doesn't, and then you try. And I guess that is something that you develop, that kind of understanding. What is organic? What feels right in this particular context? And often we say, "Oh, that's one step too far."
Yes,
That we do try something, go like, "Well, that's interesting, but it doesn't really make sense in this context." So you have to be quite sensitive, and we apply this constantly. And this is why we can go on for a very long time talking about cakes, and people who listen to us get really almost wound up about it. Like, why would you spend so much time talking about cakes? But for us, it's just like, it's just second nature. We just talk. We like to talk anyway quite a lot, but with cakes, it just opens up a whole.
I mean, it's not unusual
dimension.
in a testing situation where we would have 4 versions of one type of cake, and someone coming in might not necessarily tell the difference between each of the cakes, but they're very small things like the amount, whether the cardamom is freshly ground or sort of powdered cardamom, whether the coffee is sort of espresso or instant coffee. I mean, those things make a big difference.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
more pictures. Oh yeah. What is this?
This is our Mont Blanc tart. And do you remember how it came about? Because we wanted to
Right.
use
Well, we both love chestnuts, or
Okay.
particularly candied chestnut. And how did it
Marron
come about?
glacé. I think it
Marron
was-
glacé.
What is a Mont Blanc? I'm thinking Shelley or a pen.
Yeah, well, you're on the right track. The idea is that it's
Not.
actually a fairly traditional French dessert. Usually it's meringue with chestnut cream, and this is very sweet chestnut puree and a pile of whipped cream on top of it that resembles sort of the mountain. And when I tested it, because although I loved it, I thought meringue and chestnut, sweetened chestnut, it was just a bit too much sugar, even for me. And I thought, but actually what's really nice is texturally, having something crunchy and crisp on the bottom. And when I think I must have come to you with the meringue part, and in a separate little thing we were working on, I think the chocolate and rosemary tart with that pastry case. And I think you and I sort of instinctively sort of took the base and put the chestnut cream on top, and we thought actually that works much better than meringue.
But actually it took a while, because then we decided we were missing something, so that's when we brushed the base with chocolate, and we made these maple caramelized pecans that go on top. Remember?
Well, the caramelized maple pecans were actually for something else, which we called Knickerbocker Glory, which is a sundae. And again, texture is very important to us. So there's this sort of ice cream and cream pile up with berries. It's all very soft, and we thought actually, well, that needed nuts. But actually then the nuts went really well with this. And so it's not also the idea that you had to have a completely new recipe for every single page. If something works, then it works.
Well, and that's really interesting too, because you're both classically trained pastry chefs, among many other things, and that means something. I mean, there's the plated dessert, there's the components of a plated dessert, there are the aspects of it that when you see a well-made dessert, you have those elements. You have the crunchy bits, you have the frozen bits, you have whatever. And then so there is something that is classic and that then you riff on, theoretically.
I think in the beginning I almost see, so when I was working on this, for example, I would see that as three or four different parts. I would need to get the base absolutely right, the pastry, before moving on to the chestnut cream, and then do we add liquid to it? Is the consistency right? And then the cream, and then the nuts. So it's 4 different components, and then they have to sort of harmoniously
It's
sit
not
together.
just taste, it's texture,
But I
it's
think
color, it's everything.
What you're saying is really quite true. I think that the tools that you acquire when you are trained and then work as a pastry chef are really the language that you use later on. So you can't really break the rules without speaking the language. I mean, people talk about it in all sorts of creative places. But in baking, I think it's especially true because you really need to know how to make a pound cake or how to make a good pastry base for a tart or for a pie before you can start filling it up with different things that are would have not necessarily been there. But if you don't know those things, you're going to mess it up completely. And the tools in pastry are very clear. You know, pastry cream is something you learn how to make and you know it. You know, and the same applies for particular pastries in particular cakes. Once you master that language, you can start playing around, and this is the fun bit. But
yeah, it's kind of like the line drawing before you learn to paint.
Yeah.
And I mean, Yotam's talking about the pastry, and we infuse ours for one of the recipes for our donuts with saffron. You know, so it's a traditional.
The pastry cream, you mean?
Pastry cream. What did I say?
Pastry,
okay, the pastry cream. And so it has our sort of saffron flavor.
Right. But it's still pastry cream, and that's where you
the
start,
technique
and that's
is
your point.
absolutely
Right.
pastry cream.
Hence the cookbook. I mean, the importance of good dessert, pastry, baking cookbooks. One could argue is, you know, of extreme importance, really, because you're teaching a technique.
Yes, I think the books are essential for baking. They're more essential for baking than they are for cooking because they are formulas.
Right.
And in baking, you need to follow a formula before you start playing around. And in cooking, there's all sorts of ways to cook. You can even just chop it up and eat it raw often. You know, whether it's a vegetable or a piece of good meat or whatever. You can do very little. In the world of baking, it doesn't work. You can't eat your flour raw. I do like a good raw cookie mix, but you need to do a couple of things before it's ready to be eaten. So you need to know what you're doing. And it goes back to something we talk about quite often in these conversations, because there's like two camps. The ones that people that say I only cook, and people say I only cook and I don't bake, and people that say I do both. And there's a big chunk of people that are scared of baking. And I think it's actually, for me, it's almost counterintuitive to be scared of baking, because baking recipes are so prescriptive. They're so precise. You know, they tell you what size the tin is, what temperature the oven is. If you follow it, and it's a good, well-researched recipe, and I think these are pretty good, then you're going to succeed, really. I mean, and it doesn't. If you follow a savory recipe, it doesn't give you that level of detail. I think I said to you this morning, you can easily overcook a fish, then you can burn a cake. In my mind, you know, it's like the art of baking is much more prescriptive, and if you follow the rules, you often get it right.
In fact, when I first started cooking, one of the things that drew me to baking was this idea that you had very strict guidelines, and that actually you're less likely to go wrong with that than
It's liberating.
savory.
It's comforting, depending on whose recipe you use.
It's comforting, but also it's this very special place that baking has, because you give it time, right? Like you never bake when you're in a rush, or you shouldn't really. You can cook when you're in a rush because you need to feed people, but baking is always the extra. So you normally take time to bake, and that extra time is a really
it's the sort of love that goes into it. I think apart from the sort of technical aspects of the book, we're also wanting to sort of reclaim something of the tradition of baking, the kind of cultures that it speaks of. You know, the sort of your grandmother's cooking. I have a couple of recipes in there from sort of Australian, very old Australian recipes, like from the Country Women's Association. And I think it's preserving something of that as well. The ritual of baking.
Yeah, I think that's why many of us have children who obsessively watch the Great British Baking Show.
Right.
I mean, that really keyed into something that people miss, respect, love, cherish. Whatever.
Yeah, I think also because we have, one of the problems is, I think, with sugar at the moment, is we've been exposed to a lot of sugar in the wrong context.
Right, flour too.
And flour too. So the sugars in particular that we're exposed to often comes in a form of a snack or something that is processed in a factory, and I think when you bake and you get closer with the sugar, you have a much better understanding of what goes into your cake, you probably paradoxically eat less sugar if you bake than you would if you don't bake, because it's a much more solid thing. And when Helen says that he talks about the tradition of baking, that's exactly what it's got to offer. It's a context for the sugar, for us to understand, really understand, and then you don't eat too much, or you tend to eat less.
Yeah,
or
Michael
hoard less.
Pollan said something like that, I think. I'm getting this right. Eat whatever you want as long as you make it yourself, or something.
Yeah, because then
along
there's a
those lines.
respect for
Yeah.
the product. There's a respect for actually the fact that you spent time doing it, that you source the ingredients, you put it together, and usually it's offered in the context of a sort of social environment,
Which gets you back to gift giving and
Yeah.
those little things.
Yeah.
Yeah. More pictures? Oh, cool.
These are the Middle Eastern shortbread. It's Millionaire's shortbread. So Millionaire's shortbread is familiar here? Yeah?
No?
Yeah. So it's, do you want to explain Millionaire shortbread? So it's it's shortbread base.
Well, it's a Scottish thing, isn't it? Is it?
I think you might be
Essentially, it's
inside.
caramel and chocolate,
Yeah.
and a shortbread
Shortbread.
base. And there's one more thing that I can't think of at the moment. So
It's shortbread, caramel, and melted chocolate.
yeah,
This-
that's true. And you
yeah,
buy it
don't
in
forget
the
that.
Usually,
part.
but not this one.
No, so this is our version of it. Our take, and it has halva and tahini. And when you make the caramel, you add the tahini to the caramel, so it's got a really beautiful tahini flavor. And that kind of, because tahini is very
Savory.
it's very nutty and very
Yeah,
savory, and
yeah,
it's
yeah.
great for caramel. A bit like adding salt to caramel.
Fish sauce
Fish sauce.
and caramel.
I didn't know that.
No.
Oh, yeah, it's great.
Shall
Let's
we go
do it
back
with some
till we-
nuts. Yeah, that sounds good. Because I think the thing about Millionaire's shortbread is usually they're just too sweet. They're just,
Yeah.
it's kind of
Cloying.
teeth
Oh, they have
aching.
condensed milk in them as well.
Some of them do,
Yeah.
yeah. And I think just that tahini just takes the edge of it being just too sweet.
Yeah.
And it references, obviously, Yotam's background.
But this is just so delicious with a cup of black coffee or tea. It's really to die for. I mean,
Yeah.
it's super rich. Gosh, I'd have one now if I could.
We love things sort of small sizes too.
Yeah.
Not that you stop at one, but it's just so sort of accessible and
Exactly.
yeah.
So what determined what went into the book and what didn't? Did you have rejects? Did you...
We had rejects. Not that many, but and a quince and apple pie that I was working on for a while.
It didn't make it because it was too late, really.
Yes, that's true.
That doesn't count.
We missed the deadline. That was
But
the
I think it
problem with
also
that.
went through just one test too many, and I
Then
think
you
there's a point where you think,
Write another book. That
Yeah.
doesn't count. That's not a reject.
Well, you see, this is the problem. When you do a book, you always remember the things you forget after it's too late. So you got the galleys, and you see something amazing, and it's just the editor says, "Look, it's just too late," and it's very difficult to put a
Yeah.
book aside. And
Yeah.
any person in the room that has ever written a book or been involved in the production of the book could tell you that it's just impossible. It really breaks your heart to not put a recipe that you've just discovered that is just going to make this book. So we were really trying until the very last minute to add recipes, and some really came at the very last minute. But I think the one thing that is also another thing that is you asking about rejects. It goes back to the point I tried to make at the beginning about how do you create consistency and a story in a book. And I think this book in particular, each chapter has a logic of its own. We have a whole chapter about cheesecakes because, first of all, we love cheesecakes, but also because we wanted a cheesecake for every season and for every fruit.
and every texture.
Because cheesecakes are often reliant on fruit. So, we had the one with cranberries and white chocolate for, the end of the year. But then Helen said, "Oh, we need one tropical for every season." And we've got the ones with the berries for the summer. So you want to kind of create an offering for every season.
We didn't set out sort of having these chapters. It kind of fell into these chapters, didn't it? And we also listened to our testers, And usually, I mean, Yotam and I are present at every tasting, but there are usually people milling about, and we get their input. And I mean, I think the base criteria is that we had to want to eat it. We have to want to eat this thing. And I would say every recipe in there we would happily eat.
Okay, I want to see the next picture. Oh, okay, now you see why. What is this? A Louise cake?
This is called a Louise cake, and
Why?
it's actually an Antipodean, fairly traditional Antipodean offering, which is a base on the bottom, which is a sponge with some coconut in it. And usually in the traditional version, it's a layer of jam and then meringue with coconut, all baked together so that when you eat it, it's sort of one thing. And when we did it, it didn't make sense to, again, have that meringue and jam. I just, again, thought, well, it's too sweet. So we put fresh fruit in it, in this case, plums, and we cooked the fruit down first. So it's not quite jam. It's almost like a stew or stewed fruit. That was the thing that made the difference for me between something that was too much and something that was... So we're using a traditional bake that people love, but we wanted to, whether you call it modernize it or to reflect more our palates.
So was the title of the book ironic? I mean, because that's in a way a litmus test. Many desserts, traditional desserts, are too sweet. Whether that's to the modern palate or just because they always were and we didn't recognize it or want to. And so you call it sweet.
I think the title was sort of reflecting an honesty about the way we approach it, because the fact is, whether it's in fashion or vilified, every recipe in there contains sugar. Right. And Yotam was talking about this idea of hidden sugars. That's where the danger is. And we wanted to be very upfront about it, to say, yeah, it's a sweet book.
And it's not ironic in the sense that we love the sweetness of all of it. It's not like we're trying to hide it. We're trying to make something which is balanced, which is good, which is, works for the occasion. And I think the level of sweetness needs to be adjusted to the occasion. I mean, so that millionaire's shortbread, the Middle Eastern, is very sweet, but it's also got things to balance it out, and you have it with, you have a small bit with coffee. Other desserts are much less sweet, but you have more of them, and they come at the end of a meal. So every recipe has it. You judge the balance yourself, and what's quite right. It's not just like pumping it with sugar. It's about getting the right balance within a dish of how much sugar is necessary for this particular item and the context.
Right, because they're dishes, and they're creations. So you have an acid component, a salt component, a cream. You have all these little things that inform what sweet means. It seems to me.
Yeah, that's exactly how it is, and that's how we approached it. But for each one individually.
Cool. More pictures. Oh dear.
These are really great cookies.
Yeah. We really love this book, don't we?
There's, if you haven't looked at the book, there's a little bit in the prologue or the introduction or whatever about cookies. Because you both have kids, which doesn't mean there's not necessarily an intersection or a correlation, but how can there not be? So there are a lot of cookies in this book, which is kind
I think
of wonderful.
when you have young kids like we do, cookies are very handy.
Yeah.
So a cake is it's a project, but a cookie is just a little something you can have to hand and serve when you need. And with cookies, you've got a lot of flexibility, which we wanted to offer in this book. Cooking for all occasions, like we said, or for all levels of expertise. So cookies, you can make a mix and have it in the fridge or a freezer and bake it as you need it. It's something you can make for children or with children. This particular one is actually I think it's quite a grown-up cookie because it's got quite a lot of layers of flavor. It's got a bit of cinnamon, it's got pecan, and it's got a bit of banana, only half a banana in a whole batch of cookies, and it really kind of lingers. It's something that you have at the background, which is just a little bit of banana fruitiness. And so it's a proper chocolate cookie, and it's quite fudgy. We bake it until it's not completely dry. So
it's a very soft cookie.
It's a very soft cookie. But the banana flavors with the chocolate is a real treat, and you always say you have them frozen and you
Yeah,
just
I
bake
mean,
them to serve.
we've made this several times in the lead up. Obviously, the book came out earlier in the UK, and we were doing a few video shoots and photo shoots, and this was the one that we demoed a lot. And I've come to really love it. Not that I didn't before, but it was the ease of it, where I realized I would make the batch of dough, which wasn't difficult to do. And for the shoot, we would maybe form, just because we were demonstrating it, we would maybe make half a dozen. Then I would roll up all the rest and have it in the freezer. And then 2 weeks later, I would have, some friends would pop by. And within 10 minutes, I had freshly baked cookies. And it's just people are so grateful and receptive for homemade, fresh treats. Mm-hmm. And I think we also love biscuits because they're so easy to give, to make and give away, package it up nicely.
Yeah.
It's sort of low commitment to make and low commitment to eat.
Right, and you don't have to worry about taking them places and collapsing and doing
exactly.
all sorts
They're
of strange
portable.
things. Yes, portable.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's pretty.
Oh, these are the friands. These are little French cakes that are made with ground almonds or ground nuts. These are made with ground almonds and butter, and they're very simple to make.
They're like financiers?
They're a bit like
Yes.
financiers. Yeah, they're almost the same. And they have a really nice balance between kind of a crust on the outside and a soft middle.
Yes.
Normally they're nice when they're this size, kind of quite small, because you got the perfect balance between the chewiness of the outside and the softness in the middle. And we have them always on our counter because they're so good and they look good. And this is a
Beautiful.
blackberry, but you can make them with most fruits. And actually they're really delicious also without the icing. The frosting, you can do them with or without.
I think also the other thing about this cake is that the batter keeps in the fridge. Again, I like things to be as fresh as possible, but the mix keeps, and then you can just make them as and when you want them, fairly warm. Actually, my son said to me the other day when he saw this picture in the book, would I make it for him for Halloween? I thought, Halloween, really? And he said, because it's Batman. He thought that little picture up there was a bat. I thought, oh, now I can't not see it, now that I've seen it. I thought, oh, yes, you're right, it's a Batman. So I'll be making these for Halloween.
And so will everybody else.
Exactly. Thank you. Okay, one more.
So these are our bounty bars, essentially. So they're very Belinda's flourless coconut and chocolate cake. So it's a very dense coconut cake with a chocolate ice ganache on the outside.
I mean, it's so moist that it really is like eating the Bounty Bar. We would have loved to have called it that, but I think we weren't allowed to.
So who's Belinda?
Belinda is an Australian cook. Again, I like these simple cakes, and our Ottolenghification of it led to the ganache on top. Hers doesn't have that. And we loved the cake, and we wanted to add just our little bit to it, which was the Bounty Bar.
Yeah, that is one of the things that I noticed in this book is what you were talking about earlier about the components. You have building blocks, as it were, as you do in any good pastry kitchen, but also you can dress these up or down, it seems, depending on your interest and your interest in Halloween, I guess, too.
One of the things that I make very often for my children is just crepes. They like to have crepes for breakfast and sometimes even after dinner. And there's a recipe in there for crepes it's more like a blintz, so it has a cheese filling and roasted fruit. But you don't have to go the whole hog. If the crepes themselves are nice, I have it with lemon and sugar. So you don't have to make all the components, like Yotam was saying. You don't need to have that blackberry icing. It's a nice little finish. So I think when you get to know the recipes, you know at what point you want to stop at. We go the whole hog because we want to give people the option, but you don't need to do that.
Right. It's nice. It's very user-friendly, to use an overused term, but handy. Shall we take questions?
Yeah, it's that time. I'll bring a microphone just raise your hand. Just a quick reminder around here, questions start with a W or an H, sometimes a D. They are typically short. And tonight, only Amy gets to ask follow-up questions.
Thank you for being here tonight. I want to ask you about baking with tahini. I've never baked with it before. I've only used it for savory applications. And can you use it like you use peanut butter, or can you talk about how you incorporate tahini in desserts? Please?
Yeah, so it's not always, you can't swap it in, well, if you're talking about peanut butter, then yes, if it's something that you're going to use as a kind of a frosting, you can use it, and you can mix it with cream cheese to make a cream cheese and tahini icing. That's really nice. But if you want to incorporate into a cake, it's a bit more complicated because tahini absorbs a lot of moisture, and it tends to absorb that moisture from the cake, so it dries out. So you need to balance it out. I've got a couple of recipes that I published over the years that have got tahini in the batter, but you need to compensate with quite a lot of liquid, otherwise it goes dry. For instance, in the Millionaire Shortbread that we've just seen, and in our brownies, we swirl it through. In the brownies, we swirl it through, and here we make the caramel, and then you can achieve what you want to achieve, but you apply a little bit of it because it's quite intense and it's kind of cloying if you have too much of it. But it's really nice to play around with because it's a really healthy, good ingredient, and it has a great flavor, and it does balance out sweetness really beautifully, like we said about the shortbread.
What have you learned about when you trying to convert a cake to a gluten-free cake? So I noticed in some of the recipes, just looking quickly, that there's a small amount of flour.
Yeah, so flour functions differently in different cakes. Sometimes you just need a little bit of flour to stabilize something and make it, workable. And in that case, you can quite easily, most occasions, substitute to something else of similar nature, rice flour, another gluten-free flour.
Potato flour.
Potato flour. When you take a cake which is very musty, so for instance, we've got our vertical cake, it's got only a little bit of flour in that mix for the sponge, then you can substitute. Cakes that have more flour, then it's more tricky because you need the gluten and you need for it to hold the volume, and then it's just about experimenting. The obvious answer is often you substitute flour with ground nuts, and that works, but that creates a certain richness, and it's not as airy and fluffy as you would if you use flour. So those are some of the lessons.
Over here on your right.
On your right, over here. Okay, so I'd like to ask you a question about the Louise cake. Specifically, you mentioned in your book, I had a chance to look at it briefly, stone fruits like peaches and plums. And I'm interested in making this cake in the fall when really good stone fruit isn't available. So could we substitute pears or persimmons, for example, in Louise cake?
Yes, you could. I mean, one of the things that we like to take into account is also color. Sort of visually, we eat with our eyes, and that it would have to have. So that would be my only consideration if you had pears. That maybe you want to grate some chocolate into it so that chocolate's always good.
And parent chocolate is a good
combination.
Parent
chocolate is a good combination. But yeah, you could use that. I mean, keeping in mind also how soft the fruits are. I guess the stone fruits, when they bake, they sort of, you do, it depends how far you take it. So you could take it so it's completely liquid, or you could sort of layer fruit, cut, sliced pears, for example. You would cook it first, but you would have to watch that it's not too watery, because that will affect the sponge on the bottom.
Are there certain types of recipes that you wouldn't include either because they were too difficult or something you want to keep a secret?
Yes, to both questions.
Yes.
To both questions. Too difficult, yes. Certain recipes are very technical, and what we try to do, especially recipes that are served in restaurants where you've got a whole brigade working together to achieve something, and a short service in which you do it. Those are not the circumstances for most people at home. You've got limited amount of time, limited amount of resources to get what you want. So we try to put a range of recipes in different level of difficulties, but we didn't include things that are highly technical, and people would just spend hours doing them without getting much back.
Yeah, it has to deliver, and it has to be accessible, I think, above all. We wanted people to use it.
Yeah, so that was quite important. As to hiding recipes, so Helen and I have this rule that every recipe that is here that comes from the restaurants or from the delis is a genuine recipe. So we don't fiddle around with recipes just to make them not work for other people who would like to try and copy that.
Great.
Which I know I think there are certain chefs that may be engaging in this practice. But we didn't do that. So we did withhold some key recipes that we really want to keep to ourselves. There are not many of them in the restaurants. I mean, in the delis or the cafes, maybe 5 or 6 recipes that we didn't include. But there's a lot of our classics that are here, and they're exactly as they are when we bake them in the shops. We didn't try to fool anybody or make it not work.
And in fact, the recipes that we withheld, because obviously there are other people involved in the business, so we were answerable to them as well, even though obviously Yotam has a sort of final decision. But
it's a tricky one because you want to keep a few secrets, but on the other hand, I find that in our world there's fewer and fewer secrets because everything is very open, which is a very good thing. There's maybe 3 recipes or 4 recipes that are not here.
Yeah. Okay. You piqued my interest with the quince and apple pie. And are they in equal portions? And do you have to treat the quince previously, either reducing it with sugar or?
Yeah. I mean, part of why I did miss the deadline, we missed the deadline, and part of the reason for that was because the quinces and apples cook at different times. Sorry, I'm not sure where I'm looking, so I'm sorry if I'm not talking to.
Right.
Oh, hi, yes. Quinces take a long time to cook, and it was at that point when we were working on it that there was so much going on in terms of having to cook the quinces, cook the apples, make the pastry, put it together, bake it. I think we hadn't quite got to the stage where we thought the home cook wouldn't be baffled by this.
But it ended up tasting very good.
It ended up tasting very good. I mean, the proportion, I would say that's up to your taste.
Yeah.
You're right, because technically, once they're both the apples and the quinces are both cooked before it goes into the oven. So then it's up to you to decide whether you prefer more quince or more apple.
But the trouble is with only quince is that it becomes quite rich and dense. And the apples, especially cooking apples that are the ones you use, they lighten it up. So when you mix the cooked apples and the cooked quinces, you get a really nice, interesting mix. I wouldn't do just 100% quince.
I mean, quince is a very mysterious fruit. It also takes quite a lot of sugar to bring out that color. And apples that are sort of like Granny Smith's that are a little bit sharper, balance that sort of that can be quite sickly sort of flavor of quinces. And texturally, actually, I think apples are also, if there's too much quince, it's a little bit granular in taste, in texture, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the apples, so I would want to balance those things, acidity and the texture.
One more question. In making a pie crust, is there a big difference when you're cutting in butter versus melting butter? They're different approaches.
I think,
You want to repeat the question?
Yeah.
So the question is whether you would use cutting in method for butter as opposed to melting?
For crust.
For pastry crust. I'm trying to think whether I
don't
ever
really-
melt butter for
Or did you mean
pastry.
like shortening lard and butter? Or was the question the technique?
I have heard that when you melt the butter, you get a crispier crust than if you're cutting the butter. I haven't tried it. But
No, we don't use melted butter in crusts, really. We always use cold butter
And is it
to
always
create
butter?
crusts. We use butter, but we don't use shortening in our book.
Okay.
But it's completely up to anybody to use that. But melting, I think, would just destroy the texture. You really want to break it into, to the flour to adhere to the butter, to get that kind of crumbly, short texture.
We have a question up here in the balcony.
Thank you. You both spoke so lovingly about the power and the joy of using eggs in your recipes, but I am curious about aquafaba. Is it possible to use aquafaba in your recipes and still maintain the integrity of your desserts? For those of us who are, trying to cut down on cholesterol and that kind of thing.
I think we need to explain the question. So aquafaba is the water that comes in a can of chickpeas. And if you whip that up long enough, it's supposed to behave like egg whites. And so people use chickpea water as an alternative to egg whites for making meringues or cakes, etc. I've tried it in my test kitchen once, and it was a disaster. So I don't think I can give you a fair answer. Have you tried it, Helen?
I haven't, and I'm reluctant to comment on it.
We have another question up here in the balcony.
Should a home cook eat the whole of the mistakes?
The whole of their mistakes.
Yes.
What was the question? I'm
Should
sorry.
the home cook eat the whole of their mistakes?
Uh-huh.
I think if I...
Should the home cook eat their mistakes?
If it all depends how bad the mistake is. I mean, I think.
And how much of it you made.
I mean, when you burn your toast, there's only that far you can eat. I mean, you cannot eat like a black toast, right? Like a completely charred toast. But we were talking about mistakes this morning, and so often when you make cakes and you mess it all up when you roll or you ice, you can turn it into a dessert quite easily. You can throw it in a bowl and drizzle with a bit of something alcoholic and delicious, and whip some cream and pour on top, and then throw some flaked almonds, and you've got a trifle or a mess or something. So that's a good way to resurrect
Well, it's a
something that went
wonderful
wrong.
question, because at some point I was wondering how I could ask you about your past lives. As you have a PhD in psychology, you have a couple master's degrees in complet and philosophy. This is the sort of question that would come in handy for. No.
Oh, this,
what was the question?
no, I don't understand. Oh, that was the sort of
that
question
was the question.
you need a
'Cause it's a
PhD for. Yeah,
theoretically.
well, that's handy. I don't think I gave a very philosophical answer, but a
I mean,
rather practical one.
Well, how bad of a
Yeah,
mistake
I
was
mean, we
it?
were
Yeah.
making this rolled pavlova this morning with Amy. And, you have to roll it up. It's never, ever not worked, even though I always think, it's not going to work today. It's never not worked. But if you do lose your nerve, and if you do stuff it up, if you have fresh cream and your meringues made with fresh eggs and you have good fruit in there, as Yotam said, pile it into a glass and it's your eaten mess. So it's a short way of saying that if your ingredients are good and fresh, there's really not that much that can go wrong. Maybe your cake's a little overcooked and it's a bit dry, but it will be edible.
Or just follow the directions next time.
I use free-range eggs at the minimum. I don't make a rule of buying organic eggs, but great if they're there, yeah.
Okay, our next question here in the front.
Hi. We make a lot of pavlovas at home, and my mom's Australian, my cousin here is Australian, and their pavlovas come out so beautiful and high. And when I make them here, in Australia, they're flat. Every time I leave them in the oven overnight and whatever. What can we do about that?
I mean,
Is it
gosh,
the
but
humidity?
are chickens different anywhere? I mean, I can't imagine that the eggs would be that different. I mean, what I would do is, they are? Humidity absolutely makes a difference, yes. I mean, if you're talking specifically California, then yes, maybe that makes a difference. But in terms of getting because you're talking about sort of the height of it.
It starts off high and then it flattens.
Ah, right, yes. Humidity does make a big difference to meringues, yeah.
And the temperature is crucial. The oven temperature.
I mean, what I like to do with meringue is preheat the oven fairly high, so 400 degrees, and as soon as it goes in, I lower it, so then I cook it long and slow. But what happens with that is that you get the initial kind of, the crust, sort of it cooks quickly, and then it does form a crust, and then it begins the kind of marshmallow cooking inside. You want a bit of the chewiness inside, yeah. I mean, getting the right texture with... Is it getting too technical now? Or maybe you can refer to the book, yeah. Refer to the book.
I have more of a general question. Which 5 ingredients do you always keep in your house and why?
5 ingredients. So 5.
We usually get 3, so there's 2 extra.
Well, I guess if we stick to this conversation about baking, then it restricts to it's manageable, because otherwise 5 is just not enough. So obviously, for baking, I think it's really nice. I mean, I'm not going to specify the basics, but lemons and citrus in general, it's really good because you always want to have most cakes really benefit from a grating of lemon zest. It just brings out the flavors, it gives it a certain freshness. So lemons and other citrus are great to have around for baking.
You love alcohol in your
good.
A little bit of brandy to deglaze the pan.
A little bit of brandy.
Which is great, or even in pastry.
Or rum, very nice for baking.
Yeah.
Really good vanilla essence. Really, really good vanilla essence. It makes all the difference, especially if you fold it into cream for something like a pavlova. Yeah, a range of nuts.
I love nuts because it adds texture, and when you roast it, just the fragrance of nuts, I think, can make a really big difference, adding interest to things. Yeah.
We have time for 2 more questions.
I'd like to know if you have any plans to open a shop or restaurant in the U.S., specifically California, or are you going to do a cooking show?
This is a question that I get every time in every session. I'll tell you what it is. It's quite difficult for control freaks like us to lose control. And this is 11 hours away from London, and I don't know how it's going to work. Someone needs to explain to me how it works. How do you open a restaurant on the other side of the world and keep the quality? That's the problem. So it might happen, but it's a big challenge. So that's the answer for now, I'm afraid.
And our last question for the evening.
How do recipes change when you translate them from the metric system into the English system for Americans?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think when you translate from British to American, you do more than just change measurements. There's a whole process that goes into that. Some of it has to do with the ingredients. And American and British ingredients just behave differently. And some things we can get in the UK you can't really get in the US. We've got golden syrup, you've got corn syrup, and they're both inverted sugars, but they behave very differently when you cook with them and bake with them. And then the cream cheese we found is quite different. The one we have in the UK is more watery, right? Yeah. So ingredients behave differently. So just taking something and swapping it from grams to cups doesn't do the whole work. So it takes a whole, essentially, ideally, you want to just test the recipe, change from grams to cups, try with local ingredients, and then decide whether you got it right or not.
We had an American tester that
for all our
every
recipes.
Single recipe.
Yeah. And she commented, and this is how we discovered how ingredients behave differently, also for all sorts of reasons.
Well, that brings us to the end of a wonderful evening.